When you think about Malaysia, what comes to mind? Petronas Towers? Street food? Maybe tropical beaches? But here's something that'll change how you see this Southeast Asian nation forever. Deep in the rainforests of Malaysia live people whose ancestors left Africa over 50,000 years ago, making them some of the earliest humans to leave the continent. And the threads connecting Malaysia to Black American history run deeper than you could ever imagine. This isn't just about genetics, it's about revolution, solidarity, and a story that history books barely whisper about. Let me take you on a journey that bridges continents and centuries. Malaysia isn't just another dot on the map. It's a living testament to humanity's shared story, and its connection to Black America reveals truths about our world that most people never learn. The Orang Asli have been living in what we now call Malaysia for at least 25,000 years, though some evidence suggests they arrived even earlier, around 50,000 years ago. Among them are the Negrito communities, including groups like the Batek, Jahai, and Kensiu people. These folks stand between 1.4 and 1.5 meters tall, have dark skin ranging from copper to deep brown, and many have tightly coiled hair. For centuries, colonial observers couldn't wrap their heads around this. How could people who looked African be living in Southeast Asia? Here's where it gets fascinating. The Orang Asli Negrito share genetic markers that trace back to the earliest human migrations out of Africa. Scientists studying their DNA discovered something remarkable. These communities represent one of the first waves of modern humans who left Africa, traveling along what researchers call the Southern Route. Picture this. Between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, small groups of humans began leaving Africa, following coastlines through Arabia, into South Asia, and eventually reaching Southeast Asia. The ancestors of the Orang Asli were part of this ancient journey. They settled in the dense rainforests of what would become Malaysia, adapting to one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. While other human populations continued migrating, mixing and changing, many Orang Asli communities remained relatively isolated, preserving ancient genetic signatures that scientists today find invaluable for understanding human history. The Semang, as the Negrito groups are sometimes collectively called, speak Aslian languages that belong to the Austroasiatic family. They traditionally lived as hunter-gatherers, using blowguns with beautifully engraved designs for hunting, crafting intricate bamboo combs, and developing deep spiritual connections to the forest. They knew every plant, every animal, every season. Their knowledge of the rainforest ecosystem is so profound that modern scientists still learn from their traditional practices. But here's the painful part. When colonial powers, and later the Malayan government, looked at the Orang Asli, they didn't see the original people of the land. They saw primitives who needed to be civilized. During the Malayan emergency in the 1950s, British colonial forces forcibly relocated many Orang Asli communities into fortified settlements, trying to cut them off from communist insurgents hiding in the jungles. After independence, things didn't get much better. The Malaysian government has consistently failed to recognize Orang Asli land rights. Today, about 76.9% of Orang Asli live below the poverty line, and 35.2% are classified as living in hardcore poverty. Their ancestral lands have been cleared for palm oil plantations, logged for timber, and flooded for hydroelectric dams, all without proper compensation or consultation. Sound familiar? It should. This pattern of indigenous dispossession, marginalization, and forced assimilation mirrors what happened to Native Americans, to Aboriginal Australians, and to countless other indigenous peoples worldwide. The Orang Asli were even called Sakai by Malays, a derogatory term meaning slave, because historically some Orang Asli were captured and enslaved. The parallels to Black American history run deeper than just shared oppression. During the era of scientific racism in the 19th and early 20th centuries, European colonial scholars were obsessed with categorizing humans into racial hierarchies. When they encountered the Orang Asli, particularly the Negrito groups, some actually theorized they might be descendants of escaped African slaves from wrecked ships. This ridiculous theory was quickly debunked, but it reveals how colonial thinking worked. Dark skin and coiled hair automatically meant African to them because they couldn't conceive of human diversity being more complex than their simplistic categories. The truth is far more interesting. Modern genetic studies show that while Orang Asli Negrito share an ancient common ancestry with all humans who left Africa, they're genetically distinct from African populations. They've been evolving separately for tens of thousands of years. The physical similarities, like dark skin and certain hair textures, developed independently as adaptations to similar environments. This is convergent evolution, the same biological process that gave us similar body shapes in dolphins and sharks, even though one's a mammal and one's a fish. What connects the Orang Asli to African populations, and by extension to Black Americans whose ancestors were forcibly brought from Africa, is our ultimate shared origin. Every human alive today descends from populations that lived in Africa. We're all African if you go back far enough. The Orang Asli just happened to be among the earliest groups to leave, carrying with them genetic signatures that help scientists map the entire human journey across the planet. But there's another connection, one that's political and revolutionary rather than genetic. In 1964, Malcolm X traveled the world. Most people know he went to Mecca for Hajj, which transformed his understanding of Islam and race. But fewer people know about the extensive travels he made throughout Africa, the Middle East, and even back to Europe. Malcolm was building something. He was trying to connect the struggle of Black Americans with anti-colonial movements worldwide. He met with presidents, intellectuals, activists, and everyday people. In Ghana, he connected with Black American expats who had left the United States to escape racism and contribute to building newly independent African nations. In Egypt, he addressed the Organization of African Unity, arguing that the treatment of Black people in America should be seen as a human rights issue, not just a domestic civil rights matter. Malcolm understood something profound. The same systems of white supremacy that oppressed Black Americans also underpinned colonialism throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In London, he spoke at Malaysia Hall near Marble Arch, addressing the Federation of Islamic Society's students. This wasn't random. Malaysia had achieved independence from British colonial rule just a few years earlier in 1957. The country was navigating its identity, dealing with the aftermath of colonialism, and working through its own complex racial dynamics. Malaysian students studying in London were part of a broader movement of Third World intellectuals who saw connections between their struggles and those happening in America. When Malcolm stood in front of those students, he wasn't just speaking to Malaysians. He was articulating a vision of global solidarity against imperialism and racism. This vision included recognizing that colonialism in Asia and Africa operated on the same logic as racism in America. Both systems claimed white superiority. Both systems extracted resources and labor from non-white populations. Both systems used violence and laws to maintain control. Malcolm saw these connections clearly. He spoke about how the police in Harlem operated like an occupying army, similar to how French colonial forces operated in Algeria or British forces in Malaysia. Think about the emergency in Malaysia. From 1948 to 1960, the British colonial government fought communist insurgents in the Malayan jungle. They relocated hundreds of thousands of people, mostly ethnic Chinese, but also Orang Asli, into what they called new villages, which were essentially concentration camps. They sprayed Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants to destroy jungle cover, causing environmental devastation that lasted decades. They implemented collective punishment policies. Anyone suspected of supporting communists could be detained without trial. The parallels to how black communities in America were policed are striking. The surveillance, the assumption of guilt, the use of force, the destruction of communities in the name of security. These weren't coincidences. They were features of systems designed to control populations that threatened existing power structures. Malcolm X's trip to Africa and his engagement with Asian students studying in Europe represented his attempt to build what we'd now call intersectional solidarity. He recognized that fighting white supremacy in America required understanding and supporting liberation struggles everywhere. This wasn't just idealism, it was strategy. If oppressed peoples worldwide could coordinate and support each other, they'd be much harder to control. The power structures knew this too, which is why they worked so hard to prevent such connections. After Malcolm's assassination in 1965, some of these international connections faded. The civil rights movement in America became more domestically focused. Anti-colonial movements in Asia and Africa faced their own challenges building new nations. But the vision didn't die. Today, there are still threads connecting Black American activism and struggles in Southeast Asia. Modern connections between Black Americans and Malaysia are more complex than ancient genetics or 1960s revolutionary politics. They involve contemporary migration, cultural exchange, and shared experiences of racism in a globalized world. Starting in the early 2000s, Malaysia actively recruited international students, positioning itself as an affordable alternative to studying in the West. African students, including many from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and other nations, came to Malaysia for education. By 2012, around 79,000 Africans were entering Malaysia legally each year, with about 25,000 student visas issued. But here's where it gets complicated. The experience of black people in Malaysia reveals both connections and contradictions. On one hand, Malaysia is an incredibly diverse country. It's home to Malays, Chinese, Indians, indigenous groups, and various immigrant communities. On paper, this diversity should create empathy for outsiders. On the other hand, Malaysia has its own complex racial dynamics. The government maintains policies that favor ethnic Malays, called Bumi Putera policies. These affirmative action programs, implemented after racial riots in 1969, were meant to reduce economic inequality between Malays and other groups, particularly Chinese Malaysians. But they've created their own tensions and haven't done much for the Orang Asli, who are technically also Bumi Putera, but remain the poorest group in the country. Into this mix come African students and expats, particularly Nigerians. Unfortunately, a small number engaged in scams and drug trafficking, creating negative stereotypes that affected all Africans in Malaysia. Black people in Malaysia report being stopped by police more frequently, having difficulty renting apartments, and facing assumptions about criminality based solely on their skin color. One Nigerian woman named Anne, who moved to Malaysia as a child, was repeatedly called Orang Hitam as a slur, accused of stealing, and told by other children that she could only hang out with them if she could whiten the lines in her palms. As an adult, she and her mother were pulled over by police and had their car searched for no reason other than being black. These experiences mirror what Black Americans face in the United States. The assumption of criminality, the heightened police scrutiny, the everyday racism disguised as concern or curiosity. It's the same playbook, just in a different context. Some black expats in Malaysia have pushed back against this. A Nigerian man named Chukwudi Bara, who's lived in Malaysia for over a decade, created a platform called Other Expats to give voice to non-white foreigners whose experiences were ignored in expat communities dominated by white Europeans and Americans. The platform has become a space for black people, South Asians, and other non-white expats to share their stories, find community, and challenge the narrative that expats means white people. There's also the phenomenon of colorism in Malaysia and across Asia. Lighter skin is often considered more beautiful, more professional, more desirable. This isn't unique to Asia. It exists in Africa, Latin America, and within Black American communities. But in Malaysia, it intersects with the country's colonial history and complex ethnic dynamics. The British established racial hierarchies during colonialism, placing themselves at the top, then Chinese and Indians, then Malays, then Orang Asli at the bottom. Even decades after independence, these hierarchies still shape how people think about skin color and worth. For Black Americans thinking about Malaysia, these dynamics matter. Malaysia isn't a post-racial paradise. It's a place navigating its own complicated relationship with race, colonialism, and identity. But that's exactly why the connections matter. Understanding Malaysia's indigenous peoples, its colonial history, and its contemporary racial dynamics helps us see patterns. We see how colonialism and racism operate globally. We see how different it looks in different contexts, but how the underlying logic remains similar. We see opportunities for solidarity. When Orang Asli activists fight for land rights, they're fighting the same systems of dispossession that Native Americans fight. When African students in Malaysia challenge racial profiling, they're fighting the same assumptions that Black Americans face. When Malaysian activists criticize Bumiputra policies that exclude Orang Asli, they're grappling with questions about affirmative action and who deserves justice that Americans debate too. Here's something that might surprise you. Genetic studies of African Americans have occasionally turned up unexpected Southeast Asian DNA markers. Scientists debate what this means. Some think it reflects ancient connections between Native American populations who have Asian ancestry and the Southeast Asian populations they ultimately descended from tens of thousands of years ago. Remember, many African Americans have Native American ancestry due to historical interactions between communities. Others wonder if it might trace to enslaved people from Madagascar, off Africa's east coast, where populations have both African and Southeast Asian ancestry due to ancient Austronesian migrations. The point isn't to make grand claims about direct genetic connections. The point is that human history is far more interconnected than we usually imagine. We're taught to think of races as separate, ancient, and fixed. But the reality is that humans have been migrating, mixing, and creating new communities for hundreds of thousands of years. The Orang Asli remind us that the first humans to leave Africa didn't just go to Europe. They went everywhere, creating the diversity we see today. The story of Malaysia and Black America is ultimately about seeing the bigger picture. It's about understanding that struggles for justice and equality aren't isolated events happening in different places. They're connected parts of a global history of colonialism, racism, and resistance. It's about recognizing that the same systems that marginalized the Orang Asli also enslaved Africans, colonized Asia and Africa, and continue to shape inequalities today. But it's also about hope. It's about seeing that people have always resisted, always built connections, always imagined something better. Malcolm X, standing in Malaysia Hall in London, speaking to students from across Asia and Africa about fighting imperialism together. Orang Asli communities taking their land rights cases to court and winning, setting precedents. Black expats in Malaysia creating spaces where their experiences are valued. African students pursuing education and building futures despite facing discrimination. These aren't separate stories. They're chapters in an ongoing book about human struggle and solidarity. When you look at Malaysia now, see more than a tourist destination or an economic tiger. See a place where the earliest humans from Africa made their home, where those communities still fight for recognition, where modern migrations create new connections and conflicts, where the legacy of colonialism still shapes who has power and who doesn't. See the threads that connect this Southeast Asian nation to movements for Black liberation in America, to anti-colonial struggles across Africa and Asia, to indigenous rights movements worldwide. Understanding these connections doesn't just give us a more accurate picture of history, it gives us tools for the present. When we see how racism and colonialism operate globally, we can build more effective resistance. When we recognize our shared humanity, traced back to Africa tens of thousands of years ago, we can counter the divisions that systems of power try to create between us. The Orang Asli facing land dispossession in Malaysia, Black Americans facing police violence in the United States, Africans facing discrimination as students and migrants worldwide. These are connected struggles, not identical, but connected. They require us to think beyond our immediate communities while staying rooted in our specific fights. They require global vision combined with local action. So the next time someone asks what Malaysia has to do with Black America, you'll know the answer runs deep. It runs back 50,000 years to ancient migrations. It runs through the Middle Passage and colonialism. It runs through Malcolm X building international solidarity in the 1960s. It runs through modern migrations and contemporary struggles against racism. It runs through the fundamental truth that we're all part of one human family, sharing this planet, fighting for dignity and justice in our own ways, but ultimately fighting the same systems that try to divide and oppress us. That's the connection between Malaysian history and Black America. It's genetic, political, historical, and contemporary. It's about the past, present, and future. It's about seeing yourself in others across oceans and understanding that their liberation is tied to yours. If that doesn't change how you see the world, I don't know what will. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about these connections. Have you thought about Malaysia differently? Do you see parallels to other struggles worldwide? And if you want to dive deeper into these stories of global solidarity and hidden histories, make sure to subscribe, because we're just getting started. The world is far more connected than they taught us in school, and every connection we discover is a tool for building the future we deserve.